Well, it's April 21st, 2025. This morning I woke up and with the rest of the world was shocked, disappointed, saddened to learn that Pope Francis had died. And over the last several hours, I've seen one particular video being tweeted and retweeted, reposted on social media. And it's the clip of a young grieving boy who lost his father, who asks the Pope, whispers into his ear the question, where will his father be? Will his father be in heaven? Because his father was an atheist. And so Pope Francis listens to the boy's question, then sends him back to sit down. And then he shares the question the boy asked with the audience gathered. Says, yes, this boy asked if his father would be in heaven. And his atheist father, though he was an atheist, nonetheless had his four children baptized. So, what will become of the father? And that's the point at which I'm now going to play the clip, the rest of the clip, where Pope Francis offers his thoughts to the boy and to the audience gathered. And then I'll offer some theological reflections on the other side.
Chi dice chi va in cielo è Dio. Ma com'è il cuore di Dio davanti a un papà così? Com'è? Cosa vi sembra a voi? Un cuore di papà. Dio ha un cuore di papà. E davanti a un papà, che non credente, è stato capace di battezzare i figli e di darle quella bravura ai figli. Voi pensate che Dio sarebbe capace di lasciarlo lontano da te? Pensate quello? Ma forte, con coraggio. Dio abbandona i suoi figli? Dio abbandona i suoi figli quando sono bravi? Ecco, Emanuele, questa è la risposta. Dio sicuramente era fiero del tuo papà, perché è più facile, essendo credente, battezzare i figli che essendo non credente battezzarli. E sicuramente a Dio questo è piaciuto tanto. Parla con tuo papà, prega tuo papà.
And that's the little boy. All right, let's debrief this now. I'm reminded of the parable Jesus shared of two men, one who refused to go out to the field, but nonetheless eventually went out to the field and did his master's bidding, and the other one who said he would go out to the field, but in fact, he did not do so. And Jesus asked, who is the one that did the Father's will? And of course, it is the one who actually went out to the field. So that's the parable of the two sons. And it seems to me one way to, first of all, think about what St. Francis is doing here is offering a sort of theological reflection and expansion on the parable of the two sons. Who is the person who is truly devoutly following God and evincing a relationship with God? Is it the person who professes belief in God, or is it the person who does what God requires? And let's be clear, nobody here is saying, oh, you're saved because you've done good work. That is a crude misrepresentation of the conversation. The man who did his father's will by going out to the field, even after he said he would not do so, was not saved by works, but he was simply showing his devotion to the Father more poignantly and meaningfully through the work he did rather than simply through a belief he professed. Now, of course, it would be better if he had said at the outset, when the Father said to go out to the field, that he had said, yes, I will do so, and he did so. But the fact that he did so after declining to follow his father's will, nonetheless gave that greater meaningfulness and significance than the profession, which was not followed up by action. So you have a man here who says he's an atheist, doesn't believe in God. Pope Francis can't get into his mind, but what he can do is say, I'm looking at the life that he has lived encapsulated in the devotional commitment he expressed for his four children. that even though he did not believe himself, he was still willing to grant his children the gift of baptism, which is critical in Catholic theology, the role of baptism to initiate a person, give them spiritual rebirth into the life of faith. He gave his children that gift, even though he lacked himself that belief. He is like the man who went out to the field, even though he did not himself profess. So that's maybe one way to think about what Francis is doing here. Another thing that I would just like to reflect on is this question itself is just a great example of how pastoral theology and systematic theology run smack dab into one another. Pastoral theology being like, pastorally, how do you minister to people? And how do you do so in a way that is consistent with your systematic theological perspective? I'm reminded here of Elaine Pagels. Now, Elaine Pagels became very well known as a biblical scholar who popularized the Gnostic Gospels. But in one of her books, she tells the story that she began as a devout conservative Protestant. But as a teenager, when her friend died, and her friend was Jewish, not a Christian, practicing Jewish person, and someone in her church told her that her friend had gone to hell because her friend wasn't a Christian. And Elaine Pagels ended up leaving the church after hearing that. Now, there's another story about how she returned to church years later, but um, two things here. First of all, is what is your systematic theological view of the salvation of people who are outside of professed faith in Christ, including but not limited to Jewish people who have not professed a faith in Christ? And that's an important theological question. But another question is, what do you say in response to a child who's grieving the loss of a friend as a teenager? And what you always want to do is find a way to be faithful to your systematic theological beliefs. You don't want to lie, but to do so in a way that is also pastorally responsible and doesn't create pastoral carnage. Now, I don't think that I would never say myself that a child who died went to hell. It's not for me to say that at all. And I think that was theological malpractice for that person to do that. But whatever their views, you always have to find a way to communicate to people in a way that doesn't, well, it doesn't, even if you believe something is true, you don't end up communicating some narrower truth to them, but lose the bigger picture. So, for example, let's say you did believe a child who died outside of professed faith in Christ went to hell. If you were to communicate that to a grieving child who just lost their friend, the bigger story you'd be communicating to them may very well be God is monstrous and terrible, and he sends children to hell. And that would be a terrible thing to communicate to a child. So I think what you'd want to do at the bare minimum is to find a way to communicate to the child that doesn't have that impact of pastoral malpractice while still being faithful to your systematic theological perspective. And that's a balancing act, to say the least. And it would be as well for a person who believed an atheist is in hell, and you don't want to destroy a child's faith when the child asks you, "Where is my father? Are they in hell?" So there's that. But the other thing I would want to say is, if your systematic theological perspective does have the impact on other people of pastoral malpractice when they are grieving, that may be a good reason to rethink your theological perspective. Because for the most part, I'm not inclined to think that a true theology, a true understanding of a maximally good, loving, merciful God is the kind of theology that would have a devastating impact on people who are grieving. I'm inclined to think that true theology of the most perfect, unimaginably great and loving being we can imagine, which is God, a true theology would always be a theology of comfort. So that if your theology, if you have to find a way to tiptoe around issues so as to avoid causing pastoral malpractice or carnage, that may be a sign that you need to rethink your theology. And one thing I appreciated about not Saint Francis, well, I like Saint Francis too, but one thing I appreciated about Pope Francis was that he had a theology which, for the most part, he didn't have to tiptoe when people were grieving. He could say with confidence to a child that your father, your atheist father, was not far from the heart of God.